The civil rights era begins, and everybody looks at Rosa Parks as really the beginning of the civil rights era, but it really starts even sooner than that. And this is where this information is probably new to you. Um, in the beginning of the early 1900s, the true basis of the civil rights movement are decisions in Supreme Court cases. And I'm not just saying that because I like the Supreme Court, but it's the truth. In Gwynn versus the U.S. in 1915, the Supreme Court decided that the grandfather clause was a violation of the 15th Amendment and 14th Amendment. So you see an end to the grandfather clause. So I remember that because it's Gwynn grandfather, GG, right? Then next you have Smith versus Allwright. This ended the all-white primaries. So I remember that with all-right, all-white gone. So again, into the all-white primaries, and Democratic hold in the South was so strong that whomever won the primary in the South won the general election. So basically, what you were allowing for is that only white people could participate in primaries. Essentially, the blacks had no say, and therefore, even if a black person was able to vote in the general election, it was a pointless vote because the white voters had such a strong say in picking the Democratic candidate in the South. Um, Sweet versus Painter in 19 oh sorry, I got ahead of myself. I put this in here too. Another good thing in the 1940s for the civil rights era was the desegregation of the defense contractors who provided anything for the military in the United States that was per an executive order of FDR. So if you were going to build anything for the United States military, you had to do so with a desegregated workforce. And then Truman came through and desegregated the military post World War II. There's Sweet versus Painter, or Sweat versus Painter. I like to think it's Sweet. Sweet versus Painter was before Brown v. Board, and its decision set precedent for the Brown v. Board decision. In this decision, segregation in law school was considered a violation of equal protection. So law schools were integrated, again setting forth the decision in Brown v. Board where all public schools had to be integrated. And there's actually a Brown v. Board too, where the Supreme Court said, all right, y'all aren't integrating your schools fast enough. So Brown v. Board 2 said that, one of the weaknesses of the court is they can't enforce their decisions. So it's kind of the court saying, we're going to enforce this decision because we're going to direct states to integrate at all deliberate speeds. So they have to move ahead with integration at all deliberate speed. Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg in 1971. The Supreme Court ordered busing of students from one neighborhood to another neighborhood. So if you had an all-black neighborhood, you would generally have an all-black school. So Swan versus Mecklenburg, the Supreme Court said you can take students out of the all-black neighborhood and bus them to a white school. I bet a lot of your parents know about that. I bet a lot of your parents were bused. And you could ask them about it because they probably remember having to go, instead of go to a neighborhood school, go to a school down the street or further down the street in order to facilitate integration. So what you basically have is an official end to de jure segregation or segregation by law. Now, because the leaders of the civil rights movement couldn't participate in politics per voting, or like most people would be able to voice their opinion, they had to resort to different tactics. So some common tactics um, to fight de facto and even de jure segregation that might have still exist. De facto segregation, by the way, is just segregation by fact. Like segregation still in private companies, or just changing people's minds in general in society. So de facto segregation still existed. And because the leaders of the civil rights movement couldn't always participate in a common way in government, they had to find other ways to have their voices heard. Now, each one of these pictures, or these pictures, kind of show the evolution of the ideas of the civil rights movement. Common things in Montgomery, Alabama were bus boycotts, where especially uh, black maids and black nannies who really relied on the Montgomery bus system to get to their work, they boycotted the buses and had to find other ways to get to work, or they did actually just walk to work, which took them a lot of time. But instead of giving money to a company that was treating them unfairly, they decided that they were going to boycott the whole system in the first place. That's right there. And sometimes there were ride or carpools that were arranged for these women to get to work. Um, Lunch counter sit-ins. Okay, famous lunch counter sit-in is the whole entire Woolworths lunch counter, the five and dime lunch counter where you could go get a hamburger and a milkshake. Well, they wouldn't serve black people. You could get your food to go, but you couldn't eat at the lunch counter on the swirly stools. So the famous lunch counter where you see the lunch counter sit-in, where the black kids with white kids, as you see, there's a white kid right there and a white kid right there. They work together. Um, they refused to get up and move when they weren't served. And that lunch counter is actually in the Smithsonian American History Museum today. Birmingham, Alabama was a little bit more violent of a place. It was actually nicknamed Bombingham because it was so dangerous. It was also the site of the 16th Street Baptist church bombings, where the young girls were killed in a white supremacist bombing of that church. This is a picture from a march in Birmingham where the police were told to just have the dogs be let loose on the protesters. But marches and protests were um, very much a way to communicate the people of Birmingham's um, frustration with the lack of due process by the police department and the random pullovers um, by the police that were associated with KKK members. The March on Washington, of course, this brought national attention to the struggles of Southern African Americans. Really, up until the March on Washington, a lot of people up north didn't really understand how bad it was. And when you got 250,000 of people in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and you have somebody so eloquent as Dr. Martin Luther King sitting there and giving his speech about what, his dreams and what he hopes for the future, it really brought attention to the plight of African Americans in the South. Freedom Riders, again, this was for international attention. Freedom Riders were a bunch of college students who used the the segregated Greyhound bus system to travel over the summer. White people sitting in the back of the bus with their black counterparts throughout the southern states in protest of the segregated bus system. And that was, countered with violence. You can see here there's smoke coming out of the bus because somebody had gone past the bus and thrown in like a Molotov cocktail, tried to set the bus on fire. Now, of course, the movement began with nonviolence. Dr. Martin Luther King was very inspired by Gandhi passive resistance ideas. But yeah, I told you in class, what I think is actually a little bit more interesting is the when nonviolence was met with violence by the white people, it really made the white people and the authorities seem irrational. But after a while, that gets old. Having somebody constantly beat up on you and you retaliate with the law or you retaliate with silence, that can get very frustrating. And the civil rights movement did turn militant. After years of continued discrimination, the youth began to arm. I actually read a book over the summer called Negroes with Guns about an NAACP chapter president in North Carolina who was so frustrated with the continuous acts of violence towards the blacks in North Carolina that he finally encouraged them to arm themselves to protect themselves against KKK members who were attacking them. And I'm not saying I agree with that violence, I just think that that's a more interesting aspect of the civil rights movement that isn't always focused on in history classes. Um, that would kind of be, um, you know, just completely exemplified by the actions of the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers, frustrated with the lack of progress in the civil rights movement, just took to arms and the became very militant. Now, the Black Panthers did, and I know Scott's probably going to be rolling his eyes. Scott McKenzie just, I know, can't stand the Black Panthers. But the Black Panthers did contribute some positive things to this country by instituting a free lunch and a free breakfast program in schools and starting programs like Head Start, where you have very poor children that are able to get a jump start in school with pre-K programs. Okay. The achievements of the Civil Rights Act. JFK really began to try to get the ball rolling with civil rights in 1963, but he really made little headway. Um, the reality is that JFK was a Democrat from up north, and he had a really hard time using the power of the presidency to convince Southern Democrats to get on his side to push for civil rights. Really, it took LBJ in 1964. There was a lot of sympathy surrounding the assassination of JFK and the political prowess of Johnson being able to honestly, use that bully pulpit to get the Southern Democrats to support the civil rights legislation. It became a reality. Now, what the Civil Rights Act did is Congress married a Commerce Clause, the ability to regulate trade and services across state borders, and the Necessary and Proper Clause to do the following: prohibit discrimination by private businesses, like hotels and buses. People were traveling from state to state. So Congress said, hey, if you're going to travel state to state on a bus, and then while you're on the interstate, you're going to stay at a hotel that's in a different state, that now qualifies as interstate commerce, and we are going to be able to regulate the business transactions of different sectors of private business. The Civil Rights Act also prevented employer discrimination, so an employer couldn't not hire you because you were black. The Civil Rights Act was a good piece of legislation because the Department of Justice had implementation authority. And there was a clear punishment and a lot of leverage because the Civil Rights Act also established the cross-cutting sanction. If you didn't institute the civil right or implement if you didn't implement a Civil Rights Act and you were a southern state, you were going to lose funding for every single other federal program there was. The constitutionality of the Civil Rights Act was challenged in the heart of Atlanta Hotel versus the United States. Is it within the power of Congress to tell owners of businesses who they can and cannot serve? And the Supreme Court said, of course it is. It falls under the Commerce Clause and the Equal Protection Clause. So, Civil Rights Act was upheld by the courts. LBJ's Great Society. LBJ thought that one thing that was really essential to pushing civil rights was economic equality. You couldn't have one without the other. So you couldn't have social equality without giving African Americans equal economic opportunity. It's key. Now, on my desk, I have a saying that says, you're not black or white, you're all just different shades of green. Unfortunately, those people who have more green happen to be white. Now, that is changing in this country, but think about when that started, 1964. And we are in 2014, and there still is an income gap between minorities and whites. And we'll talk about Great Society and the programs of Great Society, but a lot of them deal with, again, promotion of economic equality. The Civil Rights Act was again revisited and passed and amended and perfected in 1968 and in 1991, adding protections for other minorities, and both of those also added protections for gender, so like no gender discrimination, and we'll talk about those in more depth when we get to that, women's rights.